Let's put aside everything we know, or think we know, about Africa over the last half-century, and take a look at the dark side of the story. There is a figure that is genuinely hard to believe. Over the last 50 years, more than $1.4 trillion in foreign aid has been poured into Africa. To put that into perspective, this sum is larger than the entire annual gross domestic product, GDP, of economic giants like the Netherlands, Spain, or South Korea. So, what has been the result? When this massive aid crusade first began, the poverty rate on the continent stood at around 11%. By the 1990s, despite floods of cash and relentless global campaigns, that number tragically skyrocketed to 66%. Today, it stands at around 38%. In other words, despite billions of dollars, poverty is still more than 3 times higher than when it all started. To understand how this gap widened so drastically, we need to look back at history. In the 1950s, the average Western European was only 5 times richer than the average African. Today, that gap has widened to a staggering 13 times. Right now, more than half of the continent's population is trying to survive on a meager $5.50 a day, and nearly 600 million people don't even have electricity in their homes. The West's simple misconception. Of course, Africa's poverty is not a recent phenomenon. The continent has been poorer than the rest of the world for at least the past 300 years. However, for decades, the Western world approached this problem in a very linear, almost lazy way. These people are poor because they don't have money. So, if we just give them money, the problem will be solved. That was the strategy, and since the 1960s, the amount of aid sent to the continent has increased by a staggering 120 times. It sounds very compassionate, doesn't it? When we think of aid, we immediately picture schools being built, roads being paved, and children being vaccinated. After all, this was largely the same formula that rebuilt Europe and America, turning them into the superpowers they are today. But for some reason, this formula completely failed in Africa. The first scapegoat people usually point to is colonialism. Yes, Europe ruthlessly exploited the continent for years, leaving behind a wrecked economic system that paved the way for dictators and corruption. When 30% of the population lacks clean drinking water, the sight of leaders flying around in private jets with fleets of luxury cars pretty much sums it all up. But there is much more to the story than just colonialism. Today, development experts looking at the flip side of the coin are highlighting a shocking truth. This money coming from the West isn't just going to waste, it is actively making Africa poorer. Why did the Marshall Plan fail in Africa? Once upon a time, foreign aid was seen as a magic bullet to end poverty. To be fair, the West had a rock-solid historical precedent to trust, the Marshall Plan. After World War II, Europe was left completely decimated. On top of that, communism was spreading rapidly across Western Europe, which was a total nightmare for America. In 1947, the U.S. made one of the biggest economic moves in history, pumping over $160 billion, in today's money, into Europe. The goal was to kickstart the economy, and the system worked flawlessly. Within a decade, GDP per capita in Europe grew by 35%. America gained both new trading partners and powerful mulfies in the fight against communism. Emboldened by this success, the U.S. turned its attention to Africa. In the 1960s, the average annual income in sub-Saharan Africa was under $150, literacy rates were below 30%, and life expectancy hovered around 45 years. But the continent possessed something that caught America's eye: massive reserves of oil, copper, diamonds, and rare minerals. And so, the financial faucets were turned on. Starting at around $500 million a year in the 1960s, aid reached $20 billion by the 90s. In countries like Uganda, Malawi, and Burkina Faso, foreign aid came to make up over 60% of the national budget. But bizarrely, as the money increased, Africa regressed. Between 1970 and 2000, average income actually declined despite the continent receiving nearly $600 billion. Instead of admitting its mistake, the West doubled down. In 2005, the UN and G8 summits promised to double aid. It shifted from being a state policy to a global pop culture phenomenon, complete with Live Aid concerts and celebrity charity singles, essentially becoming a global exercise in clearing Western consciences. Everyone blindly believed that money would fix everything. The result? Today, 400 million Africans still live on less than $2 a day, and the continent's share of global trade is under 3%. The real issue: institutions and broken accountability. Why did the money that lifted Europe sink Africa? The answer lies in institutions. By this, we mean the rule of law, property rights, and democracy. When the Marshall Plan began, Europe's state infrastructure, ministries, courts, tax systems, was still intact, even if damaged by the war. The incoming money flowed into systems that knew exactly how to utilize it. In Africa, however, the institutions inherited by newly independent states were programmed for only one thing: extracting wealth from the bottom and transferring it to the top. According to 2025 data, African nations make up nearly half of the bottom 30 countries in global democracy rankings. When you pour hundreds of billions of dollars in cash top-down into a broken system like this, that money doesn't go toward roads, schools, or hospitals. It goes directly toward $60,000 Rolex watches on the wrists of ministers and private jets for presidents. In fact, it is estimated that around $30 billion, nearly a third of all aid received, is stolen through corruption every single year. What is even worse is that this money actively corrupts the system further. In a normal country, the government collects taxes from its citizens. The citizens, naturally, demand accountability. Where are my taxes going? Where are the roads and schools? A government that fails to deliver gets voted out. But when a government receives nearly half of its budget from foreign donors, it no longer needs to answer to its own people. In Malawi during the 2000s, foreign aid made up 40% of the budget. While ministers squandered the money on lavish lifestyles, there was no public backlash. Why would there be? The money hadn't come out of the citizens' pockets, so they lacked the leverage to demand real change. An grisly kindness that crushes local economies. Even if we set corruption aside, foreign aid directly suffocates the natural, healthy, bottom-up economic growth of local communities. How? By competing directly with local businesses. Take the textile industry, for example. By the early 2000s, nearly 80% of the clothing sold in some African nations consisted of second-hand clothes donated from the West. While Western countries thought they were doing a good deed by donating their old clothes, the reality was that over 80% of local textile factories in Ghana were forced to shut down between 1990 and 2010. Thousands of people lost their jobs, and with them, the machinery, technical knowledge, and domestic manufacturing networks vanished. Over the past 2 decades, Africa's industrial sector shrank from 15% of the continent's economy to just 10%. Even the World Bank admits that periods of increased aid tend to cripple local manufacturing. Furthermore, these massive inflows of foreign cash artificially overvalue the local currency. When a country's currency becomes too strong, its exports become expensive on the global market, and foreign buyers go elsewhere. Countries like China, South Korea, and Taiwan became wealthy by keeping their currencies undervalued, allowing them to flood the world with cheap goods, the export-led growth model. Africa, on the other hand, sees its currency pushed up by massive foreign aid inflows, making its domestic industries uncompetitive globally. Today, Africa's export-to-GDP ratio is less than half of successful East Asian economies. The verdict: a cycle of dependency. At the end of the day, the data tells a clear story. Research shows that up to 70% of aid projects either fail to meet their targets or have no measurable impact at all. In Uganda, a third of health aid is stolen. In Haiti, less than 10% of the billions raised after the 2010 earthquake ever reached local institutions. The rest was swallowed up by foreign contractors and NGO overhead costs. This happens because when a project fails, there is no market mechanism to penalize the failure, cause bankruptcy, or lose votes. Of course, in times of crisis, like famine, war, or natural disasters, humanitarian aid saves lives, and its value is undeniable. But as a long-term development strategy, foreign aid has fundamentally failed. If we truly want to see Africa stand on its own feet, the West needs to stop throwing money at the problem just to soothe its own conscience. The solution isn't to give people fish, it lies in allowing Africa to build strong institutions, supporting local entrepreneurs, and fostering systems where governments are accountable to their own citizens, not to foreign donors. Until that shift happens, this cycle of dependency will keep spinning for decades to come.